Hare Krishna. Welcome to Books to Krishna. We hope you really enjoyed episode 3 of Lilamrita. Now, this time we are bringing you chapter 3 of Lilamrita, that is a biography of Srila Prabhupada, by way of episode 4 of this series. This has been written by Satsvarupa Das Goswami, and all rights of this book are with Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. So, welcome to the biography, episode 4 of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, which is being brought to you on the special occasion on the 125th birth anniversary of Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. A very nice saintly person. Chapter 3. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said, "There has not been, there will not be, such benefactors of the highest merit as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his devotees have been. The offer of other benefits is only a deception. It is rather a great harm, whereas the benefit done by him and his followers is the truest and greatest eternal benefit. This benefit is not for one particular country, causing mischief to another, but it benefits the whole universe." Abhay's friend Narendranath Malik was insistent. He wanted Abhay to see a sadhu from Mayapur. Naren and some of his friends already met the sadhu at his nearby ashram on Ulta Dung Junction Road, and now they wanted Abhay's opinion. Everyone within their circle of friends considered Abhay the leader. So, if Naren could tell the others that Abhay also had a high regard for the sadhu, then that would confirm their own estimation. Abhay was reluctant to go, but Naren pressed on. They stood talking amidst the passerby on the crowded early evening street as the traffic or horse-drawn hackneys, ox carts, and occasional auto taxis and motor buses moved noisily on the road. Naren put his hand firmly around his friend's arm, trying to drag him forward, while Abhay smiled but stubbornly pulled the other way. Naren argued that since they were only a few blocks away, they should at least pay a short visit. Abhay laughed and asked to be excused. People could see that the two young men were friends, but it was a curious sight. The handsome young man, dressed in white khadi kurta and dhoti, being pulled along by his friend. Naren explained that the sadhu, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, was a Vaishnava and a great devotee of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. One of his disciples, Sannyasi, had visited the Malik house and had invited them to meet Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. A few of the Maliks had gone to see him and had been very much impressed. But Abhay remained skeptical. "Oh no, I know all these sadhus," he said. "I am not going." Abhay had seen many sadhus in his childhood. Every day his father had entertained at least 3 or 4 in his home. Some of them were no more than beggars, and some even smoked ganja. Gaur Mohan had been very liberal in allowing anyone who wore the saffron robe of a sannyasi to come. But did it mean that though a man was no more than a beggar or a ganja smoker, he had to be considered saintly just because he dressed as a sannyasi or was collecting funds in the name of a building, a monastery, or could influence with his speech? No. By and large, they were disappointing lot. Abhay had even seen a man in his neighborhood who was a beggar by occupation. In the morning, when others dressed in their work clothes and went to their job, this man would put on a saffron cloth and go out to beg, and in this way earn his livelihood. But was it fitting that such a so called sadhu be paid a respectful visit as if he was a guru? Naren argued that he felt that this particular sadhu was a very learned scholar and that Abe should at least meet him and judge for himself. Abe wished that Naren would not behave this way, and finally he could no longer refuse his friend. Together they walked past the Parasnath Jain temple to Ultagand with its sign Bhaktivinod Asan, announcing it to be the quarters of the Gaudiya Mat. When they inquired at the doors, a young man recognized Mr. Malik. Naren had previously given a donation and immediately escorted them up to the roof of the second floor and into the presence of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who was sitting and enjoying the early evening atmosphere with a few disciples and guests. Sitting with his back very straight, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati appeared tall. He was slender, his arms were long, and his complexion was fair and golden. He wore round bifocals with simple frames. His nose was sharp, his forehead broad, and his expression was very scholarly, yet not at all timid. The vertical markings of Vaishnava Tilak on his forehead were familiar to Abe, as were the simple sannyas robe that draped over his right shoulder, leaving the other shoulder and half his chest bare. He wore tulsi neck beads, and the clay Vaishnava markings of Tilak were visible at his throat, shoulder, and upper arm. A clean white Brahminical thread was looped around his neck and draped across his chest. Abhay and Naren, having both been raised in Vaishnava families, immediately offered prostrated obeisances at the sight of the revered sannyasi. While the two young men were still rising and preparing to sit before any preliminary formalities or conversation had begun, Srila Bhaktisiddhant immediately said to them, "You are educated young men. Why don't you preach Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's message throughout the whole world?" Abe could hardly believe that he had been heard. They had not even exchanged views. Yet this sadhu was telling them what they should do. Sitting face to face with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abe was gathering his wits and trying to gain a comprehensible impression. But this person had already told them to become preachers and go all over the world. Abe was immediately impressed, but he wasn't going to drop his intelligent skepticism. After all, there were assumptions in what the sadhu had said. Abe had already announced himself by his dress to be a follower of Gandhi, and he felt the impulse to rise and raise an argument. Yet, as he continued to listen to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta speak, he also began to feel won over by the sadhu's strength of conviction. He could sense that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta didn't care for anything but Lord Chaitanya, and that this was what made him great. This was why followers had gathered around him, and why Abe himself felt drawn, inspired, and humbled, and wanted to hear more. But he felt obliged to make an argument, to test the truth. Drawn irresistibly into discussion, Abe spoke up in answer to the words of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. Had so tersely spoken in the first seconds of their meeting. Who will hear your Chaitanya message? Abe queried. We are a dependent country. First, India must become independent. How can we spread Indian culture if we are under British rule? Abe had not asked haughtily, just to be proactive, yet his question was clearly a challenge. If he were to take the sadhu's remark to them as a serious one, and there was nothing in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's demeanor to indicate that he had not been serious. Abe felt compelled to question how he could propose such a thing while India was still dependent. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta replied in a quiet, deep voice that Krishna consciousness didn't have to wait for a change in Indian politics, nor was it dependent on who ruled. Krishna consciousness was so important, so exclusively important, that it could not wait. Abe was struck by his boldness. How could he say such a thing? The whole world of India beyond this little Pulatdang rooftop was in turmoil and seemed to support what Abe had said. Many famous leaders of Bengal, many saints, even Gandhi himself, men who were educated and spiritually minded, all might very well have asked the same question, challenging this sadhu's relevancy. And yet he was dismissing everything and everyone as if they were of no consequence. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta continued, whether one power or another ruled was a temporary situation, but the eternal reality is Krishna consciousness, and the real self is the spirit soul. No man made political system, therefore, could actually help humanity. This was the verdict of the Vedic scriptures and the line of spiritual masters. Although everyone is an eternal servant of God, when one takes himself to be the temporary body and regards the nation of his birth as worshipable, he comes under illusion. The leaders and followers of the world's political movements, including the movements of Swaraj, were simply cultivating this illusion. Real welfare work, whether individual, social, or political, should help prepare a person for his next life and help him re establish his eternal relationship with the Supreme. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had articulated these ideas many times before in his writings. There has not been, there will not be such benefactors of the highest merit as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his devotees have been. The offer of other benefits is only a deception, it is rather a great harm, whereas the benefit done by him and his followers is the truest and greatest eternal benefit. This benefit is not for one particular country causing mischief to another, but it benefits the whole universe. The kindness that Srila Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has shown to jivas absolves them eternally from all wants, from all inconveniences, and from all the distresses. That kindness does not produce any evil, and the jivas who have it will not be victims of the evils of the world. As Abhay listened attentively to the arguments of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he recalled a Bengali poet who had written that even less advanced civilizations like China and Japan were independent and yet India labored under political oppression. Abe knew well the philosophy of nationalism, which stressed that Indian independence had to come first, and oppressed people was a reality. The British slaughter of innocent citizens was a reality, and independence would benefit people. Spiritual life was a luxury that could be afforded only after independence. In the present times, the cause of national liberation from the British was the only relevant spiritual movement. The people's cause was in itself God. Yet, because Abe had been raised a Vaishnav, he appreciated that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was saying. Abe had already concluded that this was certainly not just another questionable sadhu, and he perceived the truth in what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said. This sadhu wasn't concocting his own philosophy, and he wasn't simply proud or belligerent, even though he spoke in a way that kicked out practically every other philosophy. He was speaking the eternal teaching of the Vedic literature. and the sages, and Abhay loved to hear it. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, speaking sometime in English and sometime in Bengali and sometime quoting the Sanskrit verses of the Bhagavad Gita, spoke of Shri Krishna as the highest Vedic authority. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna had declared that a person should give up whatever duty he considers religious and surrender unto him the personality of Godhead. And the Srimad Bhagavatam confirmed the same thing. All other forms of religion are impure and should be thrown out, and only Bhagavatam Dharam, performing one's duties to please the Supreme Lord, should remain. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's presentation was so cognate, and that anyone who accepted the Shastras should have to accept his conclusion. The people were now faithless, said Bhaktisiddhanta, and therefore they no longer believed that devotional service could remove all anomalies, even on the political scene. He went on to criticize anyone who was ignorant of the soul and yet claimed to be a leader. He even cited names of contemporary leaders and pointed out their failures, and he emphasized the urgent need to render the highest good to humanity by educating people about the eternal soul and the soul's relation to Krishna and devotional service. Abhay had never forgotten the worship of Lord Krishna or his teachings in Bhagavad Gita, and his family had always worshipped Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, whose mission Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was espousing. As these Gaudiya Mat people worship Krishna, he also had worshipped Krishna throughout his life and had never forgotten Krishna. But now he was astounded to hear the Vaishnava philosophy presented so masterfully. Despite his involvement in college, marriage, national movement, and other affairs, he had never forgotten Krishna. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was now stirring up within him his original Krishna consciousness. And by the words of the spiritual master, not only was he remembering Krishna, but he felt his Krishna consciousness being enhanced 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. What had been unspoken in Abhay's boyhood, what had been vague in Jagannath Puri, what he had been distracted from at college, what he had been protected in by his father now surged forth within Abhay in responsive feeling, and he wanted to keep it. He himself he felt himself defeated, but he liked it. He suddenly realized that he had never before been defeated. But this defeat was not a loss, it was an immense gain. Srila Prabhupada said, I was from a Vaishnav family, so I could appreciate what he was preaching. Of course, he was speaking to everyone, but he found something in me, and I was convinced about his argument and mode of presentation. I was so much struck with wonder. I could understand. Here is the proper person who can give a real religious idea. It was late. Abhay and Naren had been talking with him for more than 2 hours. One of the brahmacharis gave them each a bit of prasadam in their open palms, and they rose gratefully and took their leave. They walked down the stairs and onto the street. The night was dark. Here and there a light was burning, and there were some open shops. Abe pondered in great satisfaction what he had just heard. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's explanation of the independence movement as a temporary, incomplete cause had made a deep impression on him. He felt himself less a nationalist and a more a follower of Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He also thought that it would have been better if he were not married. This great personality was asking him to preach. He could have immediately joined, but he was married, and to leave his family would be an injustice. Walking away from the ashram, Naren turned to his friend. So, Abhay, What was your impression? What do you think of him? He is wonderful, replied Abhay. The message of Lord Chaitanya is in the hands of a very expert person. Srila Prabhupada said, I accept him as my spiritual master immediately, not officially, but in my heart. I was thinking that I had met a very nice saintly person. After his first meeting with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abhay began to associate more with the Gaudiya Math devotees. They gave him books and told him the history of their spiritual master. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was one of the 10 children born of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, a great Vaishnava teacher in the disciplic line from Lord Chaitanya himself. Before the time of Bhaktivinoda, the teachings of Lord Chaitanya had been obscured by teachers and sect falsely, claiming to be followers of Lord Chaitanya, but deviating in various drastic ways from his pure teachings. The good reputation of Vaishnavism had been compromised. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, however, through his prolific writing and through his social position as a high government officer, re-established the respectability of Vaishnavism. He preached that the teachings of Lord Chaitanya were the highest form of theism and were intended not for a particular sect or a religion or a nation, but for all the people of the world. He prophesied that Lord Chaitanya's teaching would go worldwide and he yearned for it. The religion preached by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is universal and not exclusive. The principle of Kirtan as the future church of the world invites all classes of men, without distinction of caste or clan, to the highest cultivation of the spirit. The church, it appears, will extend all over the world and take the place of all sectarian churches, which exclude outsiders from the presence of mosque, church, or temple. Lord Chaitanya did not advent himself to liberate only a few men of India. Rather, his main objective was to emancipate all living entities of all countries throughout the entire universe and preach the eternal religion. Lord Chaitanya says in Chaitanya Bhagavat, in every town, country, and village, my name will be sung. There is no doubt that this unquestionable order will come to pass. Although there is still no pure society of Vaishnavas to be had, yet Lord Chaitanya's prophetic words will in a few days come true. I am sure. Why not? Nothing is absolutely pure in the beginning. From imperfection, purity will come about. Oh, for that day when the fortunate English, French, Russian, German, and American people will take up the banners, mridangs, and kartals and will raise kirtan throughout the streets and towns. When will that day come? As a prominent magistrate, Bhakti Vinod Thakur was a responsible government officer. He served also as superintendent of the temple of Lord Jagannath and was the father of 10 children. Yet, in spite of these responsibilities, he served the cause of Krishna with prodigious energy. After coming home from his office in the evening, taking his meal and going to bed, he would sleep from 8 until midnight and then get up and write until the morning. He wrote more than 100 books during his life and many of them in English. One of his important contribution with the cooperation of Jagannath Das Babaji and Gaur Kishore Das Babaji was to locate the exact birthplace of Lord Chaitanya in Mayapur, about 60 miles north of Calcutta. While working to reform Gaudiya Vaishnavism in India, he prayed to Lord Chaitanya, your teachings have been much depreciated. It is not in my power to restore them, and he prayed for a son to help him in his preaching. When on February 6, 1874, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was born to Bhaktivinoda Thakur In Jagannath Puri, the Vaishnavas considered him the answer to his father's prayer. He was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck and draped across his chest like the sacred thread worn by Brahmins. His parents gave him the name Bimla Prasad. While Bimla Prasad was a 6 month old, the carts of the Jagannath festival stopped at the gate of Bhaktivedanta residence and for 3 days could not be moved. Bhaktivinoda Thakur's wife brought the infant onto the cart and approached the deity of Lord Jagannath. Spontaneously, the infant extended his arms and touched the feet of Lord Jagannath and was immediately blessed with a garland that fell from the body of the Lord. When Bhaktivinoda Thakur learned that the Lord's garland had fallen onto his son, he realized that this was the son for whom he had prayed. One day, when Bimla Prasad was still a child of no more than 4 years, his father mildly rebuked him for eating a mango not yet duly offered to Lord Krishna. Bimla Prasad, although only a child, considered himself an offender to the Lord and vowed never to eat mangoes. This was a vow that he would follow throughout his life. By the time Bimla Prasad was 7 years old, he had memorized the entire Bhagavad Gita and could even explain its verses. His father then began training him in the proofreading and printing in conjunction with the publishing of the Vaishnava magazine, Sajjan Tosani. With his father, he visited many holy places and heard discourses from learned pandits. As a student, Bimla Prasad preferred to read the books written by his father instead of the school texts. By the time he was 25, he had become well versed in Sanskrit, mathematics, and astronomy, and he had established himself as the author and publisher of many magazines, articles, and books, Surya Siddhanta, for which he received the epithet Siddhanta Saraswati in recognition of his erudition. When he was 26, his father guided him to take initiation from a renowned Vaishnava saint, Gaurakishore Das Babaji, who advised him to preach the absolute truth and keep aside all other work. Receiving the blessings of Gaur Kishore Das Babaji, Bimla Prasad, now Siddhanta Saraswati, resolved to dedicate his body, mind, words to the service of Lord Krishna. In 1905, Siddhanta Saraswati took a vow to chant the Hare Krishna mantra a billion times. Residing in Mayapur in a grass hut near the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya, he chanted the Hare Krishna mantra day and night. He cooked rice once a day in an earthen pot and ate nothing more. He slept on the ground, and when the rainwater leaked through the grass ceiling, he sat beneath an umbrella chanting. In 1911, while his aging father was lying still, Siddhanta Saraswati took up a challenge against pseudo Vaishnavas who claimed that birth in their caste was the prerequisite for preaching Krishna consciousness. The caste conscious Brahman community had become incensed by Bhakti Vinod Thakur's presentation of many spiritual proofs that anyone, regardless of birth, could become a Brahman Vaishnava. This Smarta Brahmins, out to prove the inferiority of the Vaishnavas, arranged a discussion. On behalf of his indisposed father, young Siddhant Saraswati wrote an essay, The Conclusive Difference Between the Brahmins and the Vaishnavas, and submitted it before his father. Despite his poor health, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was elated to hear the arguments that would soundly defeat the challenge of the Smartas. Siddhant Saraswati then travelled to Midnapur, where Pandits from all over India had gathered for a 3 day discussion. Some of the Smrta Pandits who spoke first claimed that anyone born in a Sudra family, even though initiated by a spiritual master, could never become purified and perform the Brahmanical duties of worshipping the deity or initiating disciples. Finally, Siddhanta Saraswati delivered his speech. He began quoting Vedic references glorifying the Brahmins, and at this the Smarata scholars became very much pleased. But when he began discussing the actual qualification for becoming a Brahmana, the qualities of the Vaishnavas, the relationship between the two, and who, according to the Vedic literature, is qualified to become a spiritual master and initiate disciples, then the joy of the Vaishnavas haters disappeared. Vedanta Saraswati conclusively proved from the scripture that if one is born as a Sudra but exhibits the qualities of a Brahmana, then he should be honored as a Brahmana despite his birth. And if one is born in a Brahmana family but acts like a Sudra, then he is not a Brahmana. After his speech, Siddhanta Saraswati was congratulated by the president of the conference and thousands thronged around him. It was a victory for Vaishnavism. With the passing away of his father in 1914 and his spiritual master in 1915, Siddhanta Saraswati continued the mission of Lord Chaitanya. He assumed editorship of Sajjan Tosani and established the Bhagavad Press in Krishnanagar. Then in 1918, in Mayapur, he sat down before a picture of Gaur Kishore Das Babaji and initiated himself into the sannyas order. At this time, he assumed the sannyas title Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was dedicated to using the printing press as the best medium for large scale distribution of Krishna consciousness. He thought of the printing press as the Brahat Mridang, a big Mridang. Although the Mridang drum had traditionally been used to accompany Kirtan even during the time of Lord Chaitanya, and although Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati himself led Kirtan parties and sent groups of devotees chanting in the streets and playing on the mridangs, such Kirtans could be heard only for a block or two. But with the Brahat Mridang, the big Mridang, drums of the printing press, the message of Lord Chaitanya could be heard all over the world. Most of the literature Abhay began reading had been printed on the Bhagavad press, which Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had established in 1915. The Bhagavad press had printed the Chaitanya Charitama with commentary by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the Bhagavad Gita with commentary by Vishwanath Chakravarti, and one after another the works of Bhakti Vinod Thakur. This literature was the spiritual heritage coming from Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who had appeared almost 500 years before. Abhay had been a devotee of Lord Chaitanya since childhood, and he was familiar with the life of Lord Chaitanya through the well known scripture Chaitanya Charitamrita and Chaitanya Bhagavatam. He had learned of Lord Chaitanya not only as the most ecstatic form of a pure devotee who had spread the chanting of the holy name to all parts of India, but also as a direct appearance of Sri Krishna himself in the form of Radha and Krishna combined. But now, for the first time, Abhay was in touch with the great wealth of literature compiled by the Lord's immediate associates and followers, passed down in disciplic succession and expanded on by great authorities. Lord Chaitanya's immediate followers, Srila Rupa Goswami, Srila Sanatan Goswami, Srila Jiva Goswami, and others had compiled many volumes based on the Vedic scriptures and proving conclusively that Lord Chaitanya's teaching was the essence of Vedic wisdom. There were many books not yet published, but Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was intent on establishing many presses just to release the sound of the Brahat Mridang for the benefit of all. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was teaching the conclusion of Lord Chaitanya's teaching that Lord Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead and the chanting of his holy name should be stressed above all other religious practices. In former ages, other methods of attaining to God had been available, but in the present age of Kali, only the chanting of Hare Krishna would be effective. On the authority of the scriptures such as Brahmaradhya Puran and the Upanishad, Bhakti Vinod Thakur had specifically cited the Mahamantra Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Lord Krishna himself had confirmed in Bhagavad Gita that the only method of attaining him was devotional service. Abandon all varieties of religion and just surrender unto me. I shall deliver you from all sinful reactions. Do not fear. Abe knew these verses, he knew the chanting, and he knew the conclusions of the Gita. But now, as he eagerly read the writings of the great acharyas, he had fresh realizations of the scope of Lord Chaitanya's mission. Now he was discovering the depth of his own Vaishnava's heritage and his efficacy for bringing about the highest welfare for people in an age destined to be full of troubles. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was often traveling and Abhay was busy with his family and business, so to arrange another meeting was not possible. Yet from their first encounter, Abhay had considered Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati his spiritual master, and Abhay began thinking of him always. I have met such a nice, saintly person. Whenever people possible, Abhay would seek out Srila Bhaktisiddhanta disciples, the members of the Gaudiya Math. As for Gandhi's movement, Gandhi had suffered a bitter setback when his non-violent followers had blundered and committed violence during a protest. The British had taken the opportunity to arrest Gandhi and sentence him to 6 years in jail. Although his followers still revered him, the nationalist movement had lost much of its impetus. But regardless of that, Abhay was no longer interested. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had defeated his idea that nationalist cause was India's first priority. He had invoked Abhay's original Krishna consciousness, and Abhay now felt confident that Bhaktisiddhanta's mission was a real priority. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had invited him to preach, and from that moment, Abhay had wanted to join the Gaudiya Math as one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's disciples. But now, instead of his political inclination, it was his family's obligation that stood in the way. He was no longer thinking, first let us become an independent nation and then we shall preach about Lord Chaitanya. Now he was thinking, I cannot take part like the others. I have my family responsibility. And the family was growing. In 1921, Abe and his family had their first child, a son, and there would be more children and more income would be needed. Earning money meant sacrificing time and energy, and it meant, at least externally, being distracted from the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Indian culture had the highest regard for the family institution, and divorce was unheard of. Even if a man was in great financial difficulty, he would remain with his wife and children. Although Abhay expressed regret at not being a sannyasi disciple in the Gaudiya Math, he never seriously considered leaving his young wife so early in their marriage. Gaur Mohan was pleased to hear of his son's attraction to a Vaishnava guru, but he never expected Abhay to abandon responsibility and enter the renounced order. A Vaishnava could remain with wife and family, practice spiritual life at home, and even become active in preaching. Abhay would have to find ways to serve the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati as a family man. Abe thought that if he were to become a very successful in business, then he could spend money not only to support his family but also to help support Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's mission of spreading Krishna consciousness. An astrologer had even predicted that Abe would become one of the wealthiest men in India, but with his present income, he could do little more than provide for his family's need. He thought he might do better by trying to develop a business on his own. Abe expressed his feelings to Dr. Bose, who listened like a sympathetic father and suggested that Abe become his agent for all of North India. Abe could purchase medicines, liniments, rectified spirits, toothpaste, and other items wholesale from doctors Bose factory and traveled widely throughout North India, building up his own business. Also, Abe had enough experience with Bose laboratory that he could try to make and market some of his own medicine and products. Dr. Bose and Abe decided that the centrally located city of Allahabad would be a good place for Abe to make his headquarters. In 1923, Abe and his wife and child moved to Allahabad, a 12-hour train ride northwest from Calcutta. The British had once made Allahabad the capital of the United Provinces, and they had built many good buildings there, including buildings for a high court and a university. Europeans and affluent Indian families like the Nehrus lived in a modern, paved, well lit section of town. There was also another older section with ancient narrow street, closely lined buildings and shops. Many Bengalis resided there, and it was there that Abe decided to settle his family. He had chosen Allahabad, traditionally known as Prayag, as a good location for business, but it was also one of India's most famous places of pilgrimage. Situated at the confluence of the three holiest rivers of India, the Ganges, the Jamuna, and the Saraswati, Allahabad was the site of two of India's most widely attended spiritual events, the annual Magh Mela and the Kumbh Mela, which took place every 12 years. And in search of spiritual purification, millions of pilgrims from all over India would converge here each year at the time of the full moon in the month of Magh, January, and bathe at the junction of the three sacred rivers. Abe's home at 60 Barshahi Mandi consisted of few rented rooms. For his business, he rented a small shop in the commercial center of the city at Joston Ganj Road, where he opened his dispensary, Prayag Pharmacy, and began selling medicines, tinctures, syrups, and other products manufactured by Bose Laboratory. He met an Allahabad physician, Dr. Ghosh, who was interested in a business partnership. So Abhay asked him to become his attending physician and move his office to Prayag Pharmacy. Dr. Ghosh consented and closed his own shop, Tropical Pharmacy. At Prayag Pharmacy, Dr. Ghosh would diagnose patients and give medical prescription, which Abhay would fill. Dr. Ghosh would then receive a 25% commission from the sale of the prescription. Abe and Dr. Ghosh became friends and they would visit at each other's home and they treated each other's children like their own family member. Often they discussed their aspiration for increasing profit. Dr. Ghosh had said, Abe was a business minded man. We were all God fearing. Of course, in every home we have a small temple and we must have deities. But he used to always talk about business and how to meet family expenses. Although at home Abe wore a kurta and dhoti, sometime for business he would dress in a shirt and pants. He was a good looking, full mustache, energetic young man in his late 20s. He and Radharani De now had two children. A daughter was born after they had been in Allahabad 1 year. Gaur Mohan, who was now 75, had come to live with him. He had Abhay's widowed sister Rajeswari and her son Tulsi. Gaur Mohan mostly stayed at home, chanted on his bead, and worshipped the Saligram Sila deity of Krishna. He was satisfied that Abhay was doing right, and Abhay was satisfied to have his father living comfortably with him and freely worshipping Krishna. Abhay led a busy life. He was intent on building his business. By 8 a.m., he would go to the pharmacy where he would meet Dr. Ghosh and begin his day's work. At noon, he would come home and then he would return to the pharmacy in the late afternoon. He had purchased a large Buick for 8,000 rupees, and although he never drove it himself, he let his nephew, a good driver, use it for his taxi business. Occasionally, Abe would use the car on his own business excursions, and his nephew would then act as his chauffeur. It so happened that both Motilal Nehru and his son Jawaharlal Nehru were customers at Prayag Pharmacy. Because Jawaharlal Nehru would always order Western medicines, Abe thought he must have felt that Indians' was way was inferior. When Jawaharlal approached Abe for a political contribution and Abe donated, being a conscientious merchant, during the day Abe would talk with his customers and other friends who would stop by and they would tell him many things. A former military officer used to tell Abhay stories of World War One. He told how Marshal Foch in France had one day ordered the killing of thousands of Belgian refugees whose maintenance had become a burden to him on the battlefield. A Mohammedan gentleman, a member of the royal family in Afghanistan, would come daily with his son to sit and chat. Abe would listen to his visitors and converse pleasantly and make up their prescription, but his thoughts kept returning to his meeting with the Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He went over it again and again in his mind and how he had looked, his mannerism, what he had said. At night, Abe would go home and to his wife and children. Radharani was a chaste and faithful wife who spent her days cooking, cleaning, and caring for her two children. But she was not inclined to share her husband's interest in things spiritual. He could not convey to her his feeling about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Abe, his wife, their two children, Gaur Mohan, Abhi's younger brother, Krishna Charan, Abhi's widowed sister, Rajeshwari, and her son, Tulsidas, all were together to an Allahabad studio for a family portrait. The photo shows Abhay in his late 20s. He is thin and dark with a full mustache. His forehead is broad, his eyes are dark and clear. He wears a white kurta and dhoti and plain dark slippers. He sits in a chair, his wife standing behind him, an attractive young woman in a white khadi sari with a line of color on the border. Her slim arm rests behind Abey's head on his back of his chair, her small hand gripping the edge of the chair. Her left hand hangs by her side, gripped in a fist. She is barefoot. With his left hand, Abhay steadies his 2-year-old boy, Pacha, Prayagraj, a glaring infant on his lap, the boy seeming to scream, his baby legs and bare feet dangling by his mother's knee. Abhay seems a bit amused by the son on his lap. Abhay is a handsome Indian man, his wife an attractive woman, both young. Also behind Abhay stands his nephew Tulsi and his brother Krishna Charan. Sitting on the far right is Abhay's sister Rajeshwari, dressed in a widow's white sari, holding a Sulkaman, Abhay's daughter, on her lap. Sulakshaman is also skewering her foot, jutting towards the photographer. In the center sits Gaur Mohan. His face is shriveled and his whole body is emaciated with age. He is also wearing a white kurta and dhoti. His hands seem to be moving actively on his lap, perhaps with palsy. He is short, small, and old. Abhay traveled frequently throughout northern India, intent on expanding his sales. It was not unusual for him to be gone a few days in a week and sometime a week or more at a time as he traveled from one city to another. The pharmaceutical industry was just beginning in India. The doctors, hospitals, and pharmacies were eager to buy from the competent, gentlemanly agent who called on them from Bose Laboratory of Calcutta. He would travel by train and stay in hotels. He liked the feeling of freedom from home that traveling afforded. But the real drive was servicing accounts and getting new ones. That was his business. Riding in a third class unreserved compartment was often uncomfortable. The only seats were benches, which were often dirty, and passengers were permitted to crowd on without reservation. But that is how Abe traveled hundreds of miles every week. As the train moved between towns, he would see the numberless small villages and then the country land that spread out before him on either side of the tracks. At every stop, he would hear the cries of tea vendors as they walked along the train windows. Chai, chai, tea. The British had introduced it, and now millions of Indians were convinced that they could not get through the morning without their little glass of hot tea. As a strict Vaishnava, Abe never touched it, but his wife, much of his to his displeasure, was becoming a regular tea drinker. Although Abe was accustomed to dressing as a European businessman, he never compromised his strict Vaishnava principles. Most of his fellow Bengalis had taken up fish eating, but Abe was always careful to avoid non Vaishnava food, even at hotels. Once at a vegetarian hotel, the Empire Hindu Hotel in Bombay, he was served onions, and sometimes hotel people tried to serve him mushroom, garlic, and even eggs. But all of these he carefully avoided, keeping a small semblance of his home routine. He would take his bath early in the morning with cold water. He followed this routine year round, and then in Saranpur, he did so during the bitter cold weather. The hotel keeper was greatly surprised. Abhay conversed with many people in his travels. A doctor in Dhaka told him that on his way to the office he had passed a farmer talking to a friend and could tell by the sound of the farmer talking, the farmer's cough, that the farmer would die within a few hours. Another doctor told Abe that he had just come from seeing a pneumonia patient who was defying nature and medical science by continuing to live. He met a Mohammedan doctor in Gaya who lamented that he had just lost a patient, although he had given the man the very best medicine. Such accounts from men of the medical profession confirm Abhe's conviction that without God's sanction, no one could be saved. Not that he ever thought of his medical sales as philanthropic work. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had already convinced him that the only way to save a person was by giving him Krishna consciousness. Abhe's medical products were strictly for business. On one trip, it was 1925, he traveled through Agra, only 40 miles south of Vrindavan. Taking the opportunity, he made his first visit to holy Vrindavan. Fulfilling his childhood aspiration, he loved the sight of Vrindavan, but he could spend only a day or two, even a single day away from his sales work could be critical. As a reverent pilgrim, Abhi visited a few temples, especially the principal temples established by the followers of Lord Chaitanya, but he had to move on. There were also risks in traveling. Once he was sitting in a train compartment in Mathura station when a monkey suddenly entered and took away his belongings. Early one morning before dawn, while he was on his way to Kanpur in a two-wheeled horse carriage, the horse was going at a fast trot when suddenly it hit a large heap of rubbish in the middle of the road. The carriage turned upside down, and the horse driver, the carriage all landed in a heap, and Abe was thrown into the air, but he landed unharmed, feeling as though he had just changed to another seat. Because Abe sat but said nothing, the driver thought he had been knocked unconscious and became anxious. The passenger was all right, however, and the driver considered it a miracle. Since the cart had so violently ejected him, Abe took it that he had been saved by Krishna, and he remembered similar incidents starting with his childhood when his clothing had caught on fire. Krishna had always protected him. For 5 years, Abhay traveled widely out of Allahabad, and when he was home, he put in long hours at the dispensary, but he also spent time with his wife and played with his children. Srila Prabhupada had said, When my son was about 2 years, he was very naughty, always doing some mischief. My friends used to visit me and call my son, Pacha, Pacha, if you sit down for 1 minute silently, I'll give you a gift. But the boy failed. He could not sit down even for a minute. There was a table fan and Pacha was wanting to touch it. I said, no, no, don't touch. But again he tried to touch it. So my friend said, just lower the speed and let him touch it. So I unplugged the fan and then he touched it. It did not harm him, but it hit his finger with a loud noise, tung, and then he would not touch again. I would ask him, touch again, but he would not. As soon as his daughter, Sulakshmana, could speak, he began teaching her the Bengali translation of the prayer, Gaur Astakamam, which begins, the spiritual master is receiving benediction from the ocean of mercy, just as a cloud pours water on a forest fire to extinguish it. The spiritual master extinguishes the blazing fire of material life, of repeated birth and death. Except for his obligation and obligatory travel, Abhay stayed at home and satisfied his family. He tended diligently to his business, and it prospered. It was Kumbh Mela in January 1928. Bhakti Tripad Tirath Maharaj of the Gaudiya Math had come to Allahabad with a few men. One day he walked unannounced into the Prayag pharmacy, and all of a sudden Abhay was seeing them again. After so many years, oh, these are the people I saw before, he thought. Gaudiya Math, yes, come in. Bhakti Tripati Tirath Swami was the same sannyasi who had visited Narendranath Malik in Calcutta, a visit that had led to Abhay's going to visit Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Folding his palm in a humble gesture, standing before Abhay in simple saffron khadi robes, his shaven head with tuft of sikka in the back, his forehead marked with Vaishnava tilak, Tirath Maharaj said to Abhay, we are new here. We are going to establish a temple in Allahabad. We have heard your name, so we have come to you. Please help us. Abhay was joyful. Yes, I will help you. He contributed what money he could and then introduced Tirath Maharaj to Dr. Ghosh, who also contributed. Abhay invited the Gaudiya Math devotees to come to his home and hold a bhajan and lecture. His wife would cook prasadam. They accepted, but when they arrived, there was a misunderstanding. Gaur Mohan, who was invalid, was staying in his room upstairs. Please come down, Abhay called. There is a meeting of the Gaudiya Math. Gaur Mohan came downstairs, but when he saw the sadhus, he mistook them for impersonalists from a non devotional mission. He had not heard correctly what Abhay had said. Gaur Mohan took his seat, but he observed the saffron clothed men sullenly and even made a critical remark. Abhay, who was enlivened at the opportunity to associate with the Vaishnavas and hear from them Krishna Katha, could not understand his father's behavior. Then, as soon as Bhakti Tripatra Tirath Swami began his lecture, Gaur Mohan understood. Oh, they are Vaishnavas, he cried. Old and invalid as he was, he immediately fell down at their feet. I misunderstood you, sir. I thought you were sannyasis from another mission. I am glad to meet you. After Kumbh Mela, Pradeep Tiraswamy left, but five or six brahmachari disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati stayed on in Allahabad, maintaining a small math headquarters. They worshipped the deity, held an evening program of kirtan and lecture, and preached actively to the local people. The devotees in charge, Atulanand Brahmachari, would visit the homes of the Allahabad citizen trying to select subscriber members for the math for half a rupee per month. A person would receive a subscription to the Gaudiya Math magazine. In the course of the door-to-door soliciting, Atulanand knocked on the door of Abhay Charan Dev. Abhay received him very hospitably and offered him some rice and fruit. Abhay was very receptive to the philosophy and relished discussion with Atulanand, who made it a point to visit Mr. Day repeatedly and speak with him about Lord Chaitanya and the Bhagavad Gita. Abhay also inquired into the recent activities of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. By now, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had established the Gaudiya printing works in Calcutta and had begun the publishing the Srimad Bhagavatam in several volumes with his own annotation. He had also published an edited version of Sri Chaitanya Bhagavatam from his center in Dhaka. He had opened centers in Bhubaneswar, Madras, and Puri. Abhay's interest was insatiable. Atularan told him how in 1925 Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had led a big procession circumambulating the holy land of Navdeep, with the deities riding on the back of gorgeously decorated elephant and with devotees from all parts of India attending. Envious professional priests who opposed Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's acceptance of disciples from all castes had employed a gang to help them hurl bricks and rocks on the procession. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had continued undaunted. In 1926, he had toured throughout India preaching the message of Lord Chaitanya. He had also installed deities in the large temple of Sri Chaitanya Mat in Mayapur, and a year ago he had begun publishing his magazine Sajjan Tosani in three languages, including English edition called The Harmonist. After several visits and hours of discussion on the activities and philosophy of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Atulanandan brought Mr. Day to the Allahabad ashram. Shortly thereafter, the Mutt relocated to a rented house on South Malacha Street near Rambagh, just a short walk from Abey's house. Now it was possible for Abey to visit every evening. After work, he would attend the mat where he would play the mridanga, surprising the brahmacharis with his already developed mridanga playing skills. He sang bhajans with them and sometimes took the lead part in the congregational singing. He would also bring important persons from Allahabad to visit the mat. For the brahmacharis, Abhay seemed to give new life to their ashram, and for Abhay, new life had come to him in his reunion with the disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. In 1930, Gaur Mohan's health took a turn for the worse, and his family members gathered around him thinking that his end had come. Abhay had been in Bombay on business and it was late when he reached Allahabad and knocked on the door. Gaur Mohan told his daughter Rajeshwari, "Open the door, Abhay has come." She replied, "No, he is in Bombay." Gaur Mohan replied, "I tell you that he has come. You open the door." It was about midnight. She went downstairs and opened the door and found that her brother had come indeed. Abhay went to his father. "How are you?" "I am all right," Gaur Mohan replied. "You just take rest for the night." The next morning, Abhay called the doctor. "How your father is living, we don't know," the doctor told him. "He has practically no pulse. He has been living without food for several months." Abhay asked his father, "What is your wish? Tell me." "Why are you asking?" His father replied, "Has the doctor told you anything?" Abhay said, "No, I am asking because I am staying in Bombay and you are here. So if you have any wish, any intention, let me know. I am here for you," Gaur Mohan told him, and to give their cow to Allahabad Gaudiya. So Abhay took the cow along with her calf and donated them to the Mat. Then again he asked his father, "Have you got any other wish?" And again his father asked, "Has the doctor told you anything?" No, I'm asking simply because for my business I have to go. Then Gaur Mohan said, invite all Gaudiya Vaishnavas of Allahabad and other Vaishnavas also. Let them chant Hari Nam in the evening and you supply them with good food. That is my wish. Abhay arranged it, and in the evening the Harinam started. At 11 o'clock, all of them took prasadam and left. That night, Gaur Mohan passed away. Abhay felt the loss of his father painfully. His father had given him everything he had ever wanted, had been careful to raise him as a pure Vaishnav, and had always worshipped Radha and Krishna. Although Abhay was a competent young man, he felt lost with his dearmost protector and friend. More than anyone else, Gaur Mohan was the one who had always guided Abhay and treated him as the most special person. Without his father, Abhay now felt hopeless. He suddenly felt the same dependency he had felt as a small boy. But now, without his father, the one who had always treated him as a pet son, deserving all loving attention, the one who had given him whatever he had wanted, and who had literally prayed to every holy man he met that his son become a great devotee of Srimati Radharani, that best well wisher was now gone. On the day of Shraddh, 13 days after Gaur Mohan passed away, Abhay and his brother posed for a formal photograph. In accordance with the religious custom, the two sons had shaved off their heads. The photograph shows Abhay and his brother sitting on either side of a formal portrait of their father. The portrait is an elevated stand and is surrounded with dark cloth. The picture is nicely framed. Gaur Mohan looks old, but still thoughtful and intent, not so old as in the former portrait, where he had looked emaciated, with eyes almost dim. Abhay, with his head shaved, looks like a renounced monk, and his body is covered with robes of a monk. Simply simple drapes in broad folds covering the upper and lower parts of his body. He looks quite different than he had in a picture that was taken in the same place with the same rough carpet on the floor years before. In that picture, with his wife and children gathered around him, he was very much the young householder surrounded by his responsibilities of family and looking like he knew how to conduct himself well and move energetically in the world. But in this photo, although his children are present, they are seated unattended on the floor. Abhi's left hand is on his knee, poised and yet at rest, whereas in the former picture, his left hand had been holding his restless son. Abhi's wife is not present. In this picture, Abhi looks striking. One cannot tell that he usually has a head of hair and a mustache, which he has only recently shorn for the mournful observance of his father's passing away. Instead, this seems to be his natural appearance. There is a mysterious spiritual air about him, as one might expect in a meditating saint. His look is neither agitated nor cheerful nor sorrowful. It is peaceful and knowing, as if he has suddenly become a sadhu on the day of his father passing away. He looks like a sadhu and his father envisioned he would become. He looks as if he is and always was a sadhu and has suddenly been revealed as such on this day. Even by the most casual inspection of the photo, it appears that by shaving his head and dressing in robes with no shirt or shoes, Abe has become a sadhu. Hare Krishna. So, thus we end the chapter number 3 of Lilamrit, volume 1, a very nice and saintly person. You may please wait for the next chapter, chapter 4, which is How Shall I Serve You? Hare Krishna.